It's about the dollar. Yes, always been about the US dollar. It's the reserve currency of the world and it puts the US at the top of the food chain. But whether that lasts will depend if Saudi Arabia continues to play ball. And just this year, we have seen them begin to move away from the agenda of the United States. The Saudis are beginning to think for themselves, and this is freaking the US out. Now, just recently, OPEC Plus decided to cut their oil production by 2 million barrels per day from November, and to no one's surprise, the United States sent them an angry rebuke warning how this move could backfire for Saudi Arabia. In fact, we had the White House coming out saying the decision by OPEC Plus is one of self-interest, which is both a mistake and misguided, while also mentioning how OPEC is now aligning itself with Russia. And this is perhaps one of the biggest double standards I've ever seen. So apparently, it was alright for the Federal Reserve to print trillions of dollars back in 2020 and flood the world with inflation to save the US economy, but it's not okay for Saudi Arabia and OPEC Plus to look after their own self-interest. So it's really bizarre to say the least. Now, the most obvious impact of this oil production cut is soaring energy prices, right? Especially as winter is coming. Prices at the pump, they are going to go up. Europe has also been burning oil for energy, so electricity is going to rise in price as well. But here's the thing, the United States already sells oil and gas to Europe. They are also going to benefit from the higher prices. They are already the world's third largest oil exporter in the world, so why is there so much anger towards OPEC, and why did they call out Saudi Arabia specifically? And the real reason is because of the petrodollar. Now, the United States understands who is really in control of the dollar. Yes, the Federal Reserve, they can print tons of currency if they want to, but that doesn't inherently give it any value. In fact, it just dilutes the money supply. Now, what gives the US dollar value is oil, and Saudi Arabia, together with OPEC Plus, controls a lot of oil. And this recent move of production cuts is not really about the energy prices rising, but a sign that Saudi Arabia is acting independently from the United States. The fate of the dollar lies with the Saudis, and the US is seeing cracks in the petrodollar system. They are afraid that this might be the start of the end. So we know the US dollar is the reserve currency, right? It accounts for over 70% of all transactions in global trade and almost 60% of central bank FX reserves. And there's a good reason why the dollar is still the most useful currency today. It is accepted everywhere because of the petrodollar system. Now, first, I want us to understand what currencies actually are, right? They are just mediums of exchange. They are colorful coupons that you can use to buy goods and services. So what gives value to a currency is how much stuff you can buy using it, right? And that's why when an economy collapses, its currency also crashes because no one has any confidence that it can be used to buy goods and services there. And that's very important to keep in mind. Now, in 1971, the United States broke the Bretton Woods Agreement and it sent the dollar down into free fall. It was no longer pegged to gold, and this was a problem. The dollar was now less useful, and more importantly, it lost the trust of being backed by gold. And the United States needed the dollar as the reserve currency to stay on top. So Nixon, he sat down with the Saudis and they worked out a deal. It was an ingenious move for the United States. The US would provide Saudi Arabia with weapons and defense support, and in exchange, the Saudis could only accept US dollars in exchange for their oil. And by 1975, all of OPEC agreed to price their oil in US dollars. So if you wanted oil, you needed dollars. So just with this move, right, suddenly the dollar is the most useful currency in the world even till today. Because there's one resource that every country needs, and that is energy. But this is contingent on Saudi Arabia staying on board and sticking to the deal, right? Because if one day the Saudis decide to sell their oil for another currency, then the dollar is in big trouble. We know that China and Russia, they just signed an energy deal pricing Russian gas in rubles and the Chinese yuan. That is de-dollarization for sure, 100%. But in the grand scheme of things, it's more of a bilateral deal. It's a sideshow. The main event will be the moment Saudi Arabia decides to break the petrodollar deal. Now, the most important part of the petrodollar system, right, is how OPEC recycles their dollars back into US treasuries and bonds. And we need to talk about that for a bit. You see, when Saudi Arabia and OPEC sells their oil for dollars, they reinvest it back into the US economy. And they do this primarily by buying up tons of treasuries. Now, they had over $180 billion of US debt at one point, but now it has dropped to under $120 billion today. And this is the main reason why America could grow extremely fast and become a superpower. The largest exporter of oil took all of their proceeds and reinvested them into dollar assets. So this caused bond prices to stay high and yields to drop, so America could fuel its growth with low interest rates. And that's why the conversation is actually about keeping the dollar as the reserve currency, because the rest of the world has to earn it, right? You need to produce goods and services to accumulate the currency, but the US, through the Federal Reserve, just needs to print it into existence without doing anything else. And that's why we call it importing inflation to the world. So just imagine if one day Saudi Arabia decides to diversify their oil sales, maybe they sell it for the Chinese yuan, maybe they decide to use the euro or whatever, suddenly OPEC will have fewer dollars on hand and a smaller pool of money to reinvest back into treasuries. And remember, interest rates are now rising. So if no additional dollars gets recycled back into US bonds, this will cause bond yields to head up again. And this will stall America's growth, and if rates spike high enough, it could even trigger a debt crisis back in the US. And that's why this move by OPEC Plus to cut the production is so disturbing, right? This could be a signal that they might not follow the dollar playbook down the road. Now, Saudi Arabia today, they sell around 25% of its oil exports to China, and there were talks earlier this year about pricing in yuan. And guess what? The oil business between China and Saudi today is booming. So this is a credible threat. That's why we saw Joe Biden traveling to Saudi Arabia early in July. His agenda was simple: pump more oil whenever the US wants and use the dollar system forever. But it doesn't seem to be working. The oil production cuts is like a slap across the face. Now, we have been saying for a long time that the era of cheap energy is going away. Countries are slowly beginning to deglobalize, and each country is going to look out for their own best interests. And by cutting production, they will make more money. It's as simple as that. But aren't they afraid of the United States? Now, that's a common argument, and one of the most popular ones is that the US could sanction Saudi Arabia in retaliation for the OPEC Plus cuts. Now, in fact, there are few Democrats pushing Biden to punish them, right? There have been calls to withdraw troops from Saudi Arabia, with lawmakers saying that the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia shares Putin's worldview more than he shares ours. He doesn't appreciate American advocacy for democracy in the world. But all this is probably just posturing, because the United States cannot afford to sanction Saudi Arabia in any meaningful way. Sure, the US only imports 5% of their oil from Saudi Arabia, but the real problem lies with the dollar. It's not about how much oil they will lose out from the Middle East. Now, OPEC produces around 40% of the world's crude oil and accounts for 60% of the world's oil products exports. And this means around 60% of oil sales in the world are priced in US dollars. So if the US decides to freeze the treasury Saudi Arabia holds, they would simply price their future oil sales in other currencies and just wreck the petrodollar system. Now, even if the US keeps all of Saudi's money, suddenly those dollars are less useful. It can't be used to buy the majority of the world's oil exports, and that would be a death blow to the dollar. The strength of the dollar, guys, will crater and inflation in the US will soar. Suddenly, a ton of international dollars will flood back into the country. So you can see why things are really very tricky for the United States here. They cannot afford to do anything concrete to OPEC. Sanctions rarely work, and they definitely will backfire in this scenario. Sure, we have the US exploring response options to the OPEC cut, but there's a good chance that nothing substantial will happen. In other words, Saudi Arabia is holding the trump card, which is the petrodollar's future. And right now, we are seeing the global addiction to dollars slowly start to die off. Countries are beginning to diversify away from the dollar, and it's due to a lot of factors, right? There's the fear that the US could freeze your assets. There's also the fear that the Fed could pivot and print up trillions of dollars again, making inflation even worse. And now there's a chance that OPEC might one day price their oil away from the dollar. And in all honesty, right, All of these are really self-inflicted wounds by the United States themselves. All the money printing in '08 and 2020, plus the recent Russian sanctions are coming back to haunt the dollar. Past actions are coming back to roost. So how will America deal with this? Well, the most straightforward way, at least in my opinion, is to make the US dollar more useful, right? And that will mean unleashing American energy. They have to return to fossil fuels and start pumping out more oil and gas. But from what we have seen, it's more important to go green, right? So that option is probably not going to happen for the next 2 years at least. And this means the US dollar is in a very vulnerable position, even though the dollar index is going up. Remember, all the currency crisis popping up across the world, well, countries are starting to dump the dollar to save their own economies. In fact, world currency reserves have shrunk by $1 trillion in a record drawdown. Countries has dumped almost 8% of their dollar holdings to defend their local currencies. The world now understands how much damage rate hikes are causing when the dollar is the reserve currency. We have India selling, Japan is also selling, and China is coordinating a dollar dump. So more dollars are going to flood back into the system. And what happens next is going to be a game changer. If Saudi Arabia decides to sell their oil for other currencies, even if it's a test drive, we will see other countries slowly diversify their reserves. And if OPEC decides to sell oil in yuan, for example, then more countries will stockpile yuan as a reserve currency because it's now more useful. It's very simple. And it's very important that we take note of US and Saudi relations. If the United States lets this go and tries their best to smoothen the relationship with OPEC, then it could delay de-dollarization. But if we see the US throwing sanctions at Saudi Arabia, then the dollar's days as the world reserve currency is really numbered. And I think there will be a few red flags that we can watch out for if Saudi Arabia decides to do the unthinkable. Now, if they stop buying new treasuries and allow their previous holdings to mature without reinvesting, then this might be a sign that they are moving away from the dollar. And if Saudi Arabia suddenly begins buying gold as a reserve asset, then it is also something to pay attention to. When you buy gold, you are effectively selling away dollars for an asset that has zero counterparty risk. Now, OPEC has fired the first shot. It is a slap across the face. And now we have to wait and see how the United States reacts. So let me know what you think. Will Saudi Arabia one day break away from the petrodollar? How will the United States handle this? Let me know in the comments below. Stay safe. Be sure to smash the like button and subscribe as we navigate through these insane times.